to Writing for the Ear, narrative-driven podcasts as part of the Digital Writers Festival for 2016. My name's Beth AQ, and I'll be moderating this panel today with some wonderful humans who I'll introduce in a little bit. I would like to start today by, of course, acknowledging the people of the land on which I'm broadcasting from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, of the traditional custodians of this land, but extend that respect to Australians as the first Australians as the traditional custodians of this continent, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any descendants that might be present today. I think it's really important to kind of recognise this as we embark upon a conversation around storytelling and sound, to recognise that Aboriginal culture has one of the oldest storytelling cultures in the world, and recognise that we're gathered on a land that has a history and a story that far exceeds 220 years. It's stolen land, sovereignty was never ceded, it was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. I would like to start today by introducing our wonderful people, our wonderful creative audio makers that we have with us today. I might start with Shawn. Shawn Costello. He writes under the brand Capital Yarns as an experiment in storytelling and digital engagement. His stories are always set in Canberra, which is where he's residing from right now. And they're inspired by 3 items nominated by social media users. Then they're posted on his website. He also has self-published a printed compilation of short stories and releases a monthly podcast version. He's interested in exploring how digital engagement directly with readers can assist self-publishing authors reach their potential, disrupt the publishing industry, and give their audience a greater say in the finished product. You can follow along with Shawn at Capital Yarns on Twitter if you want. And then we have Beck Fari, wonderful Beck Fari, who's joining us from San Francisco, which is very cool. She's about to attend like the biggest and coolest audio storytelling conference in the world, Third Coast. I'm very jealous, but hello. Beck makes radio in her sleep. Well, she talks about sleep on the radio and on her podcast, SleepTalker. But when she's awake, Beck is a freelance podcast producer and has contributed to Better Off Dead, Behind the Wire, Dumbo Feather podcast. She also teaches radio and podcasting skills at Sin Media, where she's also the production manager and supervising producer for community radio program All the Best. She's spoken about independent podcasting at Audiocraft, Emerging Writers Festival, National Young Writers Festival, you name it. And she was a 2016 Wheeler Centre Hot Desk Fellow. And if you want to keep along with Beck, her Twitter is @BeckFari. And then there's me, I'm Beth. I also make radio and podcasts. I've kind of have a pretty extensive relationship with the community broadcasting sector. I've done a lot of stuff at SIN, at Triple R, at PBS and at FBI. State coordinator of All the Best, which I work on with Beck. And I'm also a supervising producer there. I produce for a theatre and dance podcast called Audio Stage. I also produce my own independent little podcast called Her Game, which explores how people experience their gender in the hypermasculine world of AFL. And used to produce for a podcast called Life in Australia, which was by the Australian Red Cross, and have made radio docos for All the Best and Radio National's Pocket Docs. Blah, welcome. So we're embarking on a very big topic today. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be said, and I can't wait to hear from both of you. But I would like to encourage anyone that is listening to follow along at the hashtag DWF16. If you do have any questions, we will leave time aside at the end to answer anything that might come up. But I thought I would like to start today by I think the best way to kind of introduce these creative audio makers is to let them share a piece of their work and kind of speak to that, and maybe speak to how it was created. So maybe we'll start with Beck. You want to share your piece?
Yeah, great. So I'm going to play a snippet of episode 13 of my podcast, SleepTalker. This one is called Fall Asleep Right Now. I've taken a clip from the intro of the show, partly because it kind of explains what the show is about and what I do. And yeah, let's take a listen, and maybe then we'll talk about it a little more.
Like, even if it doesn't look like anything, I just try to like notice the movements of whatever shapes I can see, and then slowly, I think because my REM kicks in pretty quickly, is that I do start to actually see things, and then from there it just turns into a dream.
Welcome to SleepTalker.
There's no ambiguity about it. You're either asleep or you're not. Whereas
The podcast about
they
sleep,
basically just see if when lying in a dark room for 20 minutes you fall asleep,
dreams,
and whether or not you go into REM sleep during that time. So
nightmares,
if I go to bed earlier, I wake up and it's still the same day.
and what happens in your head after dark. So that's that. Should I say anything else about that, or are we just going to play it and then chat about it a bit later?
I think maybe, do you want to talk a little bit about how you created that, or what storytelling techniques you used in that piece that you just played?
Cool. So I apologize if I'm a bit vague. It's pushing 11 p.m. here in San Francisco. It's been a long day, so I'll see how I go. So all of the stories that I produce for SleepTalker are all they're all nonfiction, and they're all interview based. So the way I make the show is I will meet with somebody, I'll talk to them for quite a long time. Most of my episodes end up being roughly 15 to 20 minutes, but I'll often talk to people for more than an hour. In the case of the piece that I just played, the person I interviewed for that, her name is Eleanor. I spoke to Eleanor for about 2 hours. And then the process of getting that interview into a story is a whole lot of listening. So I will listen at least once the whole way through to transcribe the interview. And from there, I'll take the transcript of the interview and try and figure out which parts are good. I mean, I think that there are a lot of moments in an interview that are good that don't end up making it into the final product. So I don't want to say that there are moments that weren't good, but things that kind of are in line with the mood of SleepTalker, and I feel reflect the mood of that person's sleeping patterns or that person's relationship to sleep. Yeah, so then from there I kind of whittle it down and try and figure out which parts are important in those ways, and then I'll add music and sound effects and a little bit of my own narration if any contextual information needs to be added. Yeah, and that's basically my process, and that's the same process that I went through in creating that episode that I just played that snippet from.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Beck. We'll come back a little bit to talk a bit more about your storytelling technique, but I think we'll hear from Shawn next. If I can play your snippet, Shawn, and then, did you want to say anything before it's played?
Oh, I was just going to say what a great introduction. Thanks, Beth. And say what a big fan I am of both your podcasts. I should say, you know, won't be surprised to know I'm in Canberra today, as sort of goes with the brand. I'm not in San Francisco, although I wish I was. So I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, so I wanted to also acknowledge that and say what a fantastic introduction that was, Beth. And I think the reference to the oral culture of Aboriginal Australia was fantastic and a great tie into what we're talking about and how inspiring it is for the work we all do. And I was just going to note as well, obviously you guys are the pros. I'm very much the amateur here. I don't know if I should say, but most of my podcasting is done in the closet of my bedroom. So I'm literally a amateur podcaster. So it's really cool to be with you guys. And I'd love to talk to you more about the approach you do, because I'm a big fan of both podcasts. Beck, as a chronically bad sleeper, your podcast is fantastic. And Beth, it just seems you're doing, particularly on All the Best, such a fantastic job of exploring those unknown and really interesting pockets of Australian culture, which I'm trying to do to a sort of different degree just here in little Canberra. So really, really cool to be with you today.
Wow. You're very lovely. Can I just say that we've all recorded, in the closet. I mean, I think it's good to do that.
We're all closet podcasters.
Keeps it real. Okay. Should I play your snippet now? Did you want to say anything before?
Well, I was just going to say, perhaps to give a bit of context, I've sort of transferred from writing both online and in print to podcasting sort of in the last 12 months. I think I've just gone 12 months. And the model I use is always involve social media, in that people nominate 3 items and I write them a short story set in Canberra featuring those 3 items. And this snippet we're about to hear is from a story that really lent itself to being in a podcast form. It was one of the ones that I really thought about when I was looking to the podcast medium. And it features, amongst other things, No Lights, No Lycra, which for those not familiar with it is a dance movement where you can, in a dark room to your own headphones, move any which way you like to whatever music you like. And the reason why I was so keen to do this as a podcast version, this story, was to try and give a sense of what it would be like to be at No Lights, No Lycra with local Canberra music playing. And so there's a nice snippet of the Falling Joys Locket that starts this scene off.
Someone will come up to you and be like,
Oh, sorry.
Simone closed her eyes and tried to relax into the music. She loved this song, Locket by the Falling Joys, an oldie but a goodie. She tried to let the music wash over her, feel the rhythm move through her mind, clearing away the jetsam of the day. I really like you, she quietly sang to herself as she danced. Some of the debris was clearing, but the music and dancing wasn't working as well as she would like. Usually, No Lights, No Lycra was the perfect antidote to a bad day. The concept had appealed to her from the first time a friend described the experience in Melbourne. A dark room, a great playlist of music, and an opportunity to sway and move to the music however you chose, without the fear of judgment from those surrounding you.
And probably the highlight of my podcasting so far has been that Susie, the lead singer of the Falling Joys, personally responded to my email request to say it was cool for me to use that song in the podcast.
That's awesome. Did you want to talk a little bit about any kind of storytelling techniques you feel like you utilised in that kind of piece just then?
Yeah, so obviously, because these stories are really originally written for the print, I'm always, I suppose when I'm going through them, I've got a sort of catalogue of about 40 short stories that I've written based on this idea of 3 items nominated via social media. But I've sort of go through and try and figure out which ones are going to lend themselves most suitably to audio format, and particularly giving some more, I suppose, colour and movement, for want of a better term, than just a voice. And I've been lucky enough to have some friends, some with radio experience, volunteer to read some or all of the story. So thinking about how many characters and voices might be needed, what sort of sound effects and music might fit, but also just going right back to the story, and is it going to be the sort of story that lends itself to that medium? And does it need some rewriting and some tweaking for it to work on that sort of medium? Length's a big piece of feedback that I've had, that people tend to like. I think Beck mentioned the 15 to 20 minute duration. Someone told me that's the average commute in Canberra, and so their preference was that they could get through the podcast in their commute time. So that seems to be a bit of a sweet spot. I don't know how you guys find it, but yeah, that's some feedback that I've had. So the length of the story is also important.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I definitely want to come back to podcast audience. And yeah, I think that's really interesting because you're trying to cater to, Canberrian audience. Did you say Canberrian? Yeah. Yeah, cool. Thank you so much for that, Shawn. We'll definitely come back to that. I'm just going to play a small snippet of some audio of mine. I'm going to play a snippet that was originally produced for Her Game, which is a podcast that I do about exploring the way that people experience their gender within AFL culture. And this story that I picked was also put into an episode of All the Best, but kind of similar to what Beck was talking about with the way that she produces her stories. I sat down with this woman and we spoke for probably about 45 minutes, and I knew that I had to create a piece that was like under 10 minutes. So, and when someone and you know that it's like, I don't know, like you kind of, I felt, maybe I should just play the piece, but I felt like it was really necessary to have that time to build rapport and to build relationship, and so that, she could tell the story that she wanted to tell. But this is just a snippet from it now. 2 seconds. Okay, it's coming.
Someone will come up to you and be like, oh, wow, like you're a girl and you kick like this. They got more used to hearing female voices and people would become more accepting of it.
Having women in leadership position is absolutely critical.
Taking a look at how people experience their gender in the traditionally hypermasculine world of Australian women's football. You're listening to Her Game.
When I finished school, I played amateur football, and it was more about impressing the girls. It was just this attitude towards, would you root the sister? Would you bang her? All this kind of stuff. It just was like absolutely hideous. Just really wanted to say something, but there's just no way I could have said anything. I didn't want them to find out that I was trans. I didn't want them to find out anything about my gender issues or anything about my sexuality or anything like that. And I had to just behave like an absolute dude. And I didn't even get accepted in that way. I mean, everyone knew there was something about me anyway. Clubs can be incredibly lonely places to be.
Cool. I'll just quickly speak to that. So that was Simona Castricum. She was so generous with her time. Just kind of to talk about the way that was kind of crafted. I suppose it's less about me actually writing for it, but about how I suppose I used the interview to try and make it into a narrative. And it's something that Beck and I do a lot with things like All the Best, to try and interview people in a way where I know that I wanted to take my voice out because it wasn't about me. So trying to get people to speak in full sentences, and like even getting people to reiterate things so that they might say it in a different way that, might be like more cohesive for the way that you put it together. But yeah, that was just a tiny snippet of a bigger story. But yeah, I think the main thing out of that in terms of like storytelling technique and crafting is just that, trying to get people to speak in full sentences. And also I feel like that, because that one, I played like something that was actually like quite personal to her, getting her to listen to it before it actually went anywhere so that she could kind of have autonomy over the way that she was represented. Because when I first actually sent it to her, she was like, I want you to take this bit out. And I was like, okay, cool. But yeah, it's something interesting, I think, to think about when you have the kind of power but privilege to edit someone's voice that's not yours.
Can I ask, Beth, do you do that as a rule? Do you, because I did some journalism a long time ago, and I know always making the subject feel like you've done justice to their story can be really important, but often difficult. So do you try as a rule to play back what you're intending to put to air, or it sort of depends on the circumstances?
I think it depends on the circumstances. I definitely, like in that interview that we had, it was incredibly emotionally provoking for her, and also for me, just like bearing witness to her generosity with her story. But so in that way, because I think it was so important to her, and it was such like a sensitive story, then I definitely think if it's something that's not necessarily as personal, then I don't do it, because I would never get anything done, I don't think. But Beck, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think about this a lot because I also come from a journalistic background. I studied journalism at uni, and although SleepTalker is interview based, I don't actually consider it to be journalism. I'm not reporting on anything, and I'm also not trying to get to any sort of objective truth. So what I am trying to do is create some sort of reflection of how people feel, and sometimes the best way to do that is to give people that autonomy over their own story. And I think maybe this is especially true of audio that is crafted out of interview, because you're taking what people have said in their own words, and then you're manipulating it for your own purposes, which is quite different. I imagine that's quite different to what you do, Shawn, where you're actually creating the dialogue and you're creating the story from scratch. I assume you're creating it from scratch.
Yeah, I heard a fictional writer recently, and I can't remember her name, I'm sorry, suggest that perhaps fiction writers can sort of take hold of or grab anyone's story they might come into contact with and sort of propagate it for their own fictional ends, I suppose. I'm sort of conscious of not doing it, but I think probably subconsciously, anytime you're even writing a piece of fiction, you're probably relying on a whole range of human experiences and characters you've come in contact with. And even then, I think you have to be, I think it's completely different to the scenario you're describing, but sort of being conscious that you're not stealing someone else's story or misrepresenting someone or stereotyping them in some way either. But I suppose all of us have quite a large amount of content to start with. It struck me when you guys were both talking about how much content you start with. It's a little bit like all mediums, wilds for video and movie production are the same. You start with a large amount of content, and then you've got to edit it down to something which audience can digest. And so that's always going to have a whole range of judgments and usually very innocent decisions about how best to do that. But I think, as you've both spoken about, how the subject feels about it at the end is also important.
Shawn, I wanted to chat to you about, actually writing for audio, because I know that your written pieces differ from when it's for the page and then when it's for when you're making it into your podcast. Can you maybe talk to how you, what do you do with your writing when you know that it's going to be for your podcast?
So at the moment, I'm probably inefficiently still writing for the printed form and then converting to audio. But there's obviously a whole lot of particularly descriptive text that will go into trying to describe for a reader what is happening for that character at that point in time, which can be conveyed often much more simply and easily with audio. And so at the moment, what I'm doing is each time is rereading those stories and thinking about how better you can put yourself in the shoes, like we heard from that snippet, I suppose, put yourself in the shoes of someone that no likes, no like her. There's not necessarily a need to describe so much what is happening around the person, but more importantly, audio is a fantastic medium for really making you feel like you've got that point of view of that character. So often much simpler to convert from the written form to the audio, but also being careful that you're not using a whole lot of words that aren't going to help the audience at all really appreciate what that character's thinking or experiencing.
Mm. And Beck, what about you, in terms of how you, what do you think are the best kind of techniques that you can use with an audio medium that you don't have access to in other mediums? Coming from a journalism background, what can you do with podcasting that you can't do with other types of storytelling?
So I think for me, I do produce non-sleep talker stories, but I think the best way I can answer this is probably in relation to sleep talker, because I'm talking about things that don't exist in the physical world. So I'm talking to people about things that they might remember about their dreams or about their sleeping patterns, or I'm talking to people about things that are very intangible. And so there isn't really a way to paint a picture or describe it in a literal way. And so I have published a few transcripts of Sleep Talker episodes on my website, but if you just read some of the sections, they just wouldn't make sense, because it's kind of, I guess it's like a collage of fragments of someone's very subjective memory or opinion or feeling. And yeah, there's not really, does that make sense? It's something that I can do with fragments of someone's speech that I probably couldn't do with my own words or with text or even with video, because with video I'd need to show somebody something. I don't have anything to show. So partly that's to do with what I do with the dialogue and with the audio that I record, but it's also that can also be conveyed through sound effects and through music, and so I do spend quite a bit of time, selecting the right music and trying to figure out whether there are any sound effects that that can kind of try to evoke whatever it is that the person can feel or remember.
I was going to say, Sleep Talk, it's got a very a particular tone to it. I can really hear that it's quite deliberate. It seems that it's got that, every episode's got that sleep-like, for want of a better term, feel to it. I suppose because it's really one of the most personal experiences someone has, I suppose, their sleep time. I think you've got a wonderful sort of tenor to it to really make you feel like you're almost lying down next to the people that are talking about whatever their sleep experiences are in that episode.
Thank you, Shawn. That's so lovely. That's so nice to hear, because I guess that's also something that I'm trying to do, in that Sleep Talker is literally something that you can, it's a piece, audio in general is media that you can consume with your eyes closed, and that's not really true of any other medium. So yeah, I love the idea of, being asleep with people or trying to get close to that.
Beck, in terms of storytelling techniques, like one of my favorite things about Sleep Talker is definitely your use of creative sound to try and create that sensation of what it is like to be in someone's head, which is like mind-bogglingly hard to do, and I think you do it well. I'm interested because I feel like there are a lot of podcasts that use sound as a storytelling technique in a really literal way. So it's like, if you're getting in the car, it's like open door, it's a car, I'm wondering like if you can maybe talk to like your thoughts about like maybe literal sound design versus maybe a more figurative or that kind of sound design.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of experience of using literal sound effects because, like we've talked about, my show doesn't actually exist in a specific place. and so I wouldn't want to place the story anywhere, and I feel like literal sound effects would do that. So the way I'm trying to figure out what my process is, and I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure how, because a lot of what I do is just listening to somebody's voice as much as possible. And sometimes my editorial process feels like I'm not doing anything because I'm just sitting there listening and listening and listening. So maybe I'm just procrastinating, but often I am trying to try and listen into the tone of somebody's voice. And I will spend a lot of time layering different types of music. And that's a lot of trial and error. I'll listen to an episode with this combination of music and it won't work, so I'll chop that music out and find something else. And I think remixing music is a really great tool. If I'm not a musician, so I don't have the skills to create my own music, but if a piece of music isn't working for whatever reason, it's great to be able to kind of manipulate that music as much as possible. So I don't want to get too technical, but things like slowing a track down or speeding it up, or trying to cut out as much bass or the high frequencies, if that feels like it's getting in the way, because as much as music can add a lot, it can also detract from the person's voice. Another sound effect, sound design technique that I use a lot is reverb. So that's like an echo effect. I try not to overuse it, but I find that can be a really great way to sort of emphasize particular words or particular moments, especially if somebody is like talking to themselves, which happens a lot when people are talking about, what happens in their head. They might talk to themselves. So I try and use reverb to try and get that feeling of like multiple voices or multiple versions of the same person. Yeah.
I think you touched on a really interesting point, even when you were talking about just voice and like what you can do with just voice. And I suppose for us, we mostly work in doing interviews as opposed to writing and then like reading what we've written or getting other people to read what we've written. But like thinking about how you can use somebody's voice to evoke certain emotions, I think is like a really powerful technique when it comes to audio storytelling. Like even whispering. I don't know if you can hear me. But like how that changes the way that you feel as a listener, particularly if you have your headphones and you're walking down the street and then someone's whispering in your ear and you're just like, ooh, like you feel something. I'm wondering, Shawn, as somebody that does a lot of writing and gets people, I know that you source people to read your work and also you read it as well. If that is something that comes into, like, is that something that you think about when you're sourcing talent, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, I've got a couple of people around me who are willing to help out, but I've used all the techniques Beck's used and then some, because I've got finite amount of talent available. So often I'll try and use my voice or a female voice and use tone and pitch and reverb changes to make it sound like different characters. And I've actually had people say to me, Who was that reading your podcast last week? And so that was me. Sometimes when I haven't even changed my voice. So I'm not quite sure what's happening there. But so it's a useful way of maximising the amount of voice talent I have. But for me, it's also thinking about what voice might be best. So I've got a sort of Peter, who's a really good friend of mine, has a lot of experience in community radio here. He's great because a great deep pitch, older voice for a lot of the sort of more whimsical or I suppose older voiced yarns, for want of a better term. But then if there's something that requires a younger voice, then people are unfortunately stuck with me. So I'll definitely think about whether it's male or female, what age it is. I've even roped the kids in at times, depending if it's a children's story. So trying to think about both how much talent I've got, how I'm going to use the talent I've got, and what voice might be best for it. Is definitely really important. And whether it's fair to ask the voice talent to do it for me as well. I've just done a rather creepy Halloween yarn that I'm surprised came out of my head, and I wasn't entirely comfortable asking someone else to read it. So I did it with a bit of the techniques I mentioned to try and break it up a bit with some different tone and tenure through it, just because I didn't think it was fair to ask someone else to read out some of the things I'd written.
I think that we haven't brought up something that you can do with audio storytelling is I've done, I suppose I do more interview-based kind of audio storytelling, but there's this really great piece that's done by Zasha Rosen for All the Best, and it's called 3 Things I Learned About Kisses. And I really like listening to that piece because the way that he writes for an audio medium is that he writes in really short sentences. He writes like, at 2:45, we're at the kissing booth, people are kissing. And just like those short sentences and how they create momentum in a story, and how he plays with like whispering, and also if you speed up your voice, how that makes people feel, or if you slow it right down. And I think that they're really interesting techniques that you can play with as a person that's creating audio, because it just, it affects how your listener feels about what you're saying. Yeah.
And that can be done.
Okay,
That can be done. I was just going to ask, that can be done post-production. And do you guys think is there any ethical questions, particularly, I suppose, for you guys who are interviewing people, about how much post-production work you might do to someone's voice?
I feel like I play with a lot.
I do.
I mean, yeah, but I mean, I feel like I'm not doing anything so it's like they sound like a completely different human. And I feel like maybe like what Beck spoke about before, reverb. I love reverb. Like it just, I don't know. I feel like when I put effects on people's voices, it's not necessarily to change the intent of what they're saying, but more so maybe to I don't know, Beck, what do you think?
I think it's important when someone's being interviewed that they know what the intended purpose of the interview is. And so for me, if I interview someone for SleepTalker, as part of the process of setting up the interview, I'll send them links to my work, and I'll explain, roughly how long I expect the interview to take and how long the finished version might be. I know that they're all estimates before it's actually in the editing process, but I try and be as upfront as possible about what I do so that they have a chance to listen to the kind of manipulation that I might end up doing. And so they are fully aware that it's not just going to be a raw station that gets uploaded. If the person is not familiar with SleepTalker or they haven't had a chance to listen before we interview, I'll just spend a few minutes at the start of the interview explaining my process and explaining kind of my aims. And throughout the interview, I might need to kind of refer back to those aims. So, Beth, you mentioned at the start of this about getting people to answer you in complete sentences. Sometimes it can take someone like 3 or 4 goes to actually get the answer in a complete sentence. And so if I just if I can continually refer back to those original aims and say, look, I'm going to be edited out of this conversation, or, this is what I'm ultimately trying to do, and here's how you can help me get there. Then the person is hopefully on side with what you're doing, and they're aware that their voice is going to become part of something that has been altered and manipulated.
Yeah. agree, and it's definitely something that I do as well. Is just to tell, or just to send people, if it's for her game or if it's for All the Best, just to send them, examples of what I'm making, so that they can get an idea of what they're in for, essentially. I did want to chat a little bit about who's listening to podcasts. It's obviously, important as a creator to understand the people that are consuming, and I think it's interesting because, like podcasting, I'd say is still like kind of a niche medium. Like, I don't think it's like super well resourced in Australia, for example. So I'm interested where you go to find your audience. So how you can engage with people that, for example, Beck, you're creating a podcast about sleep. How do you tap into maybe communities that already exist, so that you can build your audience?
This has been, so I don't know if I mentioned at the start, but I've been making SleepTalker for a bit over 2 years now, and it's taken me a bit over 2 years to have an audience. Like, when I started by interviewing like a small pool of my friends, and my audience was that small pool of friends, if that. I don't think all of them were really listening, and and it's taken me a while to realize. I guess I don't really have like a direct strategy for reaching new audiences. It's just been that thing of I really adore the project. I adore talking about sleep. I've continued to do that, and so very slowly I've started to tap into those people who are also interested. I've had a couple of like big jumps in my audience numbers. One of them was from episode number 6 of SleepTalker, was an interview of another podcast host. So I interviewed Jeff Emptman, who hosts Here Be Monsters, and I didn't interview him with the aim of getting a jump in audience numbers. He reached out to me with an idea for a story. He has a really interesting experience in his sleep. I wanted to interview him about that. And then when I did, and then when the episode was uploaded, he posted it on the Facebook page for his show. And so from there, and I think he also shared it on SoundCloud. And so from there, I was able to tap into his really big audience, and he's a really well-established podcaster. I didn't get all of his audience, but I got, a good chunk, and that gave me a boost. And yeah, another one was the piece that I played a snippet from. Eleanor reached out to me as well. And I interviewed her because she has a really interesting story about narcolepsy, but she also runs an online community to do with narcolepsy. And so when I made that episode, she also shared that. And so then I was tapping into that audience as well. As for directly tapping into sleep-related people, I'm not sure. I don't directly send the show to those audiences, but I try and engage with members of those communities, and hopefully can then kind of, I guess because we have shared interests, it's not like I'm selling myself to them. It's just saying, hey, we're both interested in this thing. Maybe we should both listen to this. Sorry for the really vague roundabout answer, but I suppose the main thing is just
the collaboration is a super interesting. Sorry. Okay.
Well, I guess it's just a genuine engagement with quite a. It's not really a niche topic because everyone sleeps, but it's just a genuine engagement with an area that people who have an interest in it have a really strong interest in it. Yeah.
But I think you touched on like a really important point, and something that is like quite relevant for, I suppose, engaging with an audience is like collaboration with other podcasts, with other creative audio makers. All the Best, which Beck and I both work for. We've done a collaboration with SleepTalker, we've done a collaboration with Her Game, but also apart from us, we've done collaborations with a Melbourne-based podcast producer, May Jasper, her podcast called Random Article. We've done, we've partnered with Private Parts, which is a Sydney-based podcast. But just like, I think that's a really, it's like a really good way to like tap into audiences that might already be there, but might not necessarily know about the content that you're making. Shawn, I wanted to chat to you about like talking about audience. Before, you mentioned that you kind of cater the length of your podcast to suit the average commute of a person living in Canberra, which I think is really interesting because your audience is like having a critical part in the way that you're making your audio. Can you chat a little bit about maybe what you know about your audience or how you engage with people in Canberra? I'm assuming it's your target audience.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When I started this Capital Yarn sort of idea a few years back, initially for written word, it was sort of trying to promote my hometown outside the city, but I think it's sort of turned in on itself. And I think you're right. I'm realistic that my audience is probably mainly Canberrans. I did recently.
I thought that from what you said before.
Oh no, I think you're right. No, I think you're right. I'm realistic about that. I recently visited Wellington. I am writing a story now set in Wellington under the same brand in a desperate and very obvious attempt to broaden my audience base. But what I was, I suppose, surprised about, as I said, social media is sort of a big part of what I do. People generally request their stories that way, and I participate in a thing the ACT government did a few years ago to promote Canberra through social media called the Human Brochure, and they sort of got initially a whole lot of big Australian bloggers to promote Canberra one weekend on social media to try and get it trending, and then they did the same thing with some local people that I participate in. So that led to some collaborative stuff in the sort of blogging world. And so when I came to do the podcasting, I just assumed that people that had been interested before might pick the podcast up as just another way of interacting with the stories. But as it turns out, I did a suitcase rummage a few years ago, which is a place where you sort of sell your wares out of a suitcase somewhere trendy. And I was surprised at how many people had come up who had never heard of Capital Yarns until they'd heard the podcast and were giving the sort of feedback I mentioned about how long they liked it to be and what they liked and what they didn't like. And so there was a whole nother audience there that I hadn't obviously had before. I mean, I haven't been particularly sophisticated in that. I think I get as far as trying to tie a story to go with a recent celebration. So as I mentioned, I did a Halloween story. I'll do something for Easter and something for Christmas. That's about as sophisticated as I get. But it is interesting to see compared to if I put something in the written word online, there's often quite a slow drip in terms of people picking it up, whereas the podcast tends to be clicked on immediately. And I think that's probably says something about the accessibility of audio. I think Beck said earlier, it's the only medium you can enjoy with your eyes closed. And so I think it tends to be the sort of thing that probably appeals to a different audience, and an audience that is generally going to consume it pretty quickly.
Mm. Yeah, and I think something that Beck touched on before, which was really interesting, talking about accessibility of audio, how Beck transcribes some of her interviews and puts them online, even though it doesn't have the same maybe effect of listening to them. That's another way that, it makes your podcast accessible to maybe people that can't listen or, can't engage that way, and also maybe making your podcast more searchable as well. Something that All the Best, I think is really positive about All the Best. So All the Best is a radio show and podcast that centres out of FBI, which is a community radio station in Sydney, but I work on it in Melbourne, and Beck works on it from SYN in Melbourne. And so we kind of like have these hubs that I feel like we can already tap into, because there are people that are consuming audio, even though it's in a different way. And part of my role is to repackage the stories that we make so that it can get broadcast on the storytelling show on Triple R, and Beck does a similar role. But I think for us, for All the Best, it's a good way because they're community-driven stories, they're Australian stories, trying to get them to reach audiences that would be interested in it. For us, it was like looking at avenues where people were interested in a similar thing, and being able to like rebroadcast what we do was, I think has been a really beneficial way in helping us reach more ears, I suppose. I wanted to talk, we've only got 10 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot anything you have at us at the hashtag 16. But just, Shawn and Beck, do you have any advice for anyone that wants to get into audio storytelling? I suppose like a lot of people that would be assumably listening to this now are writers first and foremost for the page. It's an assumption, but that's what I'm going with. What advice do you have for people that want to kind of enter into the world of audio storytelling?
I'm a big advocate for learning by doing. So I would definitely encourage people to just start and don't try not to worry too much about the finished product. It's really hard at the moment, I think, to put things out in the world without them being really polished. There are so many podcasts that you're inevitably going to compare yourself to. But yeah, there's no way that you're going to get to that point of being really polished and being a great sounding podcast. And I'm not saying that I am a great sounding podcast. I think I have a long way to go, but I am on that road of practicing. And yeah, there are plenty of ways you can do that. You don't need to go out and buy a bunch of fancy equipment. You can join your local community radio station. That might cost you a little bit of money, depending on what the community radio station is, but you'll get access to equipment, training, and also like-minded people who will hopefully help you with those skills. So just start. And I know it can be really confronting to just start, but I really encourage people to do that. And also listen a lot. Figure out what your favorite podcasts are, devour them, listen to your favorite episodes over and over again. I've been doing that recently on this trip. I've kind of loaded up a playlist of my favorite episodes of different podcasts that I love, even from years and years ago, re-listening them, trying to figure out what I love about them. And then are there things that you can try to emulate in your own work or do differently? Yeah.
Totally. Shawn, do you have any pearls of wisdom?
I was just going to say I'm a big podcast consumer, and when I started thinking about doing the podcast, it's exactly what Beck described. I found myself listening to all the podcasts I listen to in a very different way, to really think about the very clever tricks they're doing. And I think, Beth, you mentioned earlier how there's that very almost the cleverest form of audio you can do, where the listener may not even pick up that you've added something to the background, or you've done something to the tone or the texture of the sound in some way that's very subtle but can make a real difference to how the storytelling works. And some of the best podcasts do that really, really well. So I think Beck's advice to listen really closely to those podcasts you love and think about why you love them is great. And it's such an accessible medium. Obviously, it's a digital writers festival, and so a lot of people participating will be going digital in lots of different ways. But I think it's hard to think of a more accessible format than audio, in that people can be doing the ironing or commuting to work or sleeping, going to sleep, and still consuming that content. It's such a wonderful way of communicating with people that if you're thinking about doing it, I'd say just give it a go. and you'll likely find an audience interested, no matter how small, in my case, in what you're doing, because it's just so much fun.
I totally agree with what you both said, like listening to as much as you can. And even what Beck said, I feel like we're always learning. Like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to a point where I'm like, I am a good podcaster, you know, like I think it's a process, and I don't necessarily know if we have like a uniquely Australian sound yet. And I think that's kind of exciting, because it means that it is a time where you can experiment and you can kind of do a bunch of different things. But something that I would say is that podcasts out there, but I think finding I work in radio, and something that I always say to people when they're thinking about applying for a show on the grid, I'm just like, you should look at what we have and then find out what we don't have, and tell us why we need it. You know, it's kind of, I think, the same with podcasting. If there's something that you're really passionate about, finding out what's out there that's like it, and then thinking about how you can do it differently is, I think, the best thing that I can think of right now. But just listening to as much as you can. I think being a critical consumer makes you a better creator.
Can I ask you guys? Can I ask you guys a question about how you go converting from radio to podcasting?
Yeah.
Is there how much difference is there in terms of what goes to air on the radio and what goes to air in the podcast, and what some of the considerations in doing that?
I work in both, and I would say they're hugely different. Mostly because the type of podcasting I make is usually quite heavily produced. So I'm doing interviews, but then, you know, doing a 2-hour interview and it's like an 8-minute piece, you know, and then creating a lot of sound design around it. Maybe, you know, getting other voices. So, and radio is you prepare a lot before, and then you go in and you do it, and then it's kind of done. So for me, the way that I experience the two, I have quite a different experience of both of them. But in saying that, I also do this podcast, which is I help produce a podcast where it's essentially a conversational podcast, and like there's not a lot of editing done to it. So in that respect, it's kind of the same. But in terms of the stuff I do for All the Best and Her Game and other radio doco stuff, it's like worlds apart. But I think, actually, in saying that, I think the skills of being able to, even though I'm not doing it very well, but like speak and use a microphone and panel and understand audio, that's obviously like, I think both like this. I have no words. My words have left me. Beck, what do you think? Just talking about how good I am at speaking.
I think you did a great job. So with All the Best, I just recently compiled an episode of All the Best, and I made 3 different versions. We have half an hour on the grid at FBI. And when you have an amount of time on the grid on radio, that means you have that amount of time to the second, no more and no less. So you have to fill the time, but you also can't go over time. And that's really, really important, that everything fits to the time constraints right down to the last second. So we have 30 minutes for FBI, and we have 27 minutes 50 for the community radio network. So that's 2 versions that have to be very, very specifically timed. Then for our podcast, the podcast episodes ended up being 35 minutes long, because I felt like it was really difficult to shape the stories down. I had to for radio, but for podcasts, I could let them breathe a little bit more. So there's that kind of functional difference, but then there's also the difference in the way that people listen. So if I'm producing something for radio, I will assume that people won't be giving it their full attention. So they might be listening in the car or while they're cooking or something like that. And I know people do that with podcasts, but with podcasts, more often people are listening with headphones and they have more of their attention on it. So I can, maybe stretch things out a little bit more, use more pause or use more delicate sounds, whereas with radio I feel like I need to grab people's attention more quickly, and I kind of need to fill the time with sound more strongly. I hope that answers the question.
I think that's a really good point, like just to kind of like, as we're ending, to think about that podcast listeners don't just stumble across a podcast. It's a very active consumption, whereas like, radios, it's, older sibling, you could just jump in the car and it's just going to play and you're just going to be in halfway through. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about whenever you're making that you actually are making it for somebody that's specifically gone out of their way to choose to listen to whatever you're creating. We're coming out of time, but I just wanted to end by asking you if you had a couple of favourite podcasts that you recommend people check out.
Yeah. My favourite Australian podcast at the moment is Not By Accident, which is a podcast about Sophie Harper. So Sophie Harper is a single mum by choice. And she's making a podcast about the process of having a baby and being a mum. And internationally, I've just recently started listening to a podcast called Below the 10, which is a really great podcast from KCRW in LA. It's about people living in South LA and kind of the way they're often portrayed in the media versus how they actually are and what their lives are actually like. And it's phenomenal. I'm very entertained.
Shawn?
Oh, look, I'm probably going to be very typical here, very common. I listen to This American Life and a lot of the Slate Network stuff, particularly their political gabfest. So that's sort of my American stuff. And then locally, I'll often listen to the Wally Lead Radio National podcast on sort of moral issues, which it can be a nice way to think about something completely different on the way home from work. So commuting, I ride a bike to and from work, and so I listen to podcasts commuting, and I find there's something fantastic about being able to be somewhere else whilst you're exercising. And it can be quite eerie, actually, that if I listen back to a podcast I've listened to, I can recall exactly where I was on my commute at the time I listened to it. But I'm sure those three are very popular podcasts. I'd love to have something more interesting. I was going to be a complete suck and say, apart from SleepTalker and All the Best and her game. But I wouldn't do that.
Fine. I would say, I was going to say Not By Accident, amazing podcast.
It's very good.
Also, so good, everyone should listen to it. How to Be a Girl is definitely one of my favourite podcasts, produced out of the US, exploring the experience of a mother and a daughter who's a trans girl, and just exploring how they navigate through the world. She's quite young when she comes out to her mum, and they're just really like very personal, very beautifully put together stories that make me feel a lot of feelings, and that's what I want out of my podcasts. Locally, Private Parts out of Sydney I really like, and Paper Radio as well is a big favourite of mine, produced here in Australia. I think that's all we have time for, because we've been yabbering on for a while. Huge thank you to Beck and Shawn for all of your wonderful insight into the world of audio storytelling. The Digital Writers Festival is running until the 11th of November, so just stay on the internet and stay tuned at #DWF16.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Beth.
Shawn.
Well done, Beck. Thank you.